Ебать, сейчас у меня ебануло, стекла выбило нахуй.
Footage of Ukraine's military strikes deep into Russia's Shatura thermal power plant in the Moscow region has been released.
On the night of November 4th, Russia launched one of its most intense and wide-ranging assaults on Ukraine in recent memory. The sky filled with more than 130 drones and missiles, including Shahed-type UAVs and Iskander missiles that carved violent paths through Ukrainian airspace. As in previous attacks, the targets were not military strongholds, but critical civilian structures. The port facilities in Odessa and infrastructure in the Dnipropetrovsk region were plunged into chaos. Air raid sirens echoed through the night, followed by explosions and fires that once again reminded Ukrainians of the brutal reality they live under. But this time, the response came swiftly. Within hours, Ukraine launched a coordinated retaliatory strike that reverberated deep inside Russian-controlled territory. Major energy hubs and logistical points came under fire. Lukoil's refinery in Volgograd, a thermal power plant in Kostroma, fuel storage sites in Crimea, and, most important of all, the drone launch and storage facilities responsible for the barrage that hit Ukrainian cities. Everything began with Donetsk, a city under Russian occupation since 2015. Once home to one of Ukraine's most advanced infrastructure projects, the international airport, it had been transformed into a major operational center for drone warfare. Over recent months, it became the primary launch site for waves of UAVs used against civilian regions across Ukraine. Ukrainian intelligence had been observing this location carefully. The 414th Separate UAV Brigade, led by Robert Mady Brovdy, tracked the flow of drones, components, and fuel. For weeks, the intelligence picture grew clearer. This was the hub where drones were assembled, stored, and sent towards cities like Odessa, Kharkiv, and Kyiv. By early November, after repeated strikes on civilian targets, Ukraine made a choice. This facility could not remain operational. On the night of November 5th, Ukraine initiated a tightly coordinated operation involving special operations units, unmanned systems forces, missile teams, and artillery. Attack drones and cruise missiles were launched at the same moment, overwhelming Russian defenses. According to Ukrainian special forces, more than 90% of the drones reached their targets. Moments later, the ground erupted in massive detonations. One explosion was followed by another, larger, deeper, and unlike anything filmed at the airport before. And this raised one crucial question. What exactly was destroyed inside Donetsk that night? A warehouse of fire. Though official confirmation remains limited, intelligence reports from multiple channels indicated that the targeted warehouse at Donetsk contained an enormous stockpile. Roughly 1,000 Shahed-type UAVs and over 1,500 associated warheads. In a single night, these weapons, intended for future attacks on Ukrainian power grids, apartment blocks, and civilian areas, were obliterated. A winter offensive built around drone saturation was suddenly compromised. This strike did more than eliminate hardware. It dismantled a logistical structure Russia relied on for sustained pressure during the cold months. Thousands of potential explosions, blackouts, and civilian casualties were prevented before they could occur. But Ukraine's operation did not stop at the drone warehouse. Multiple components of the airbase were damaged or destroyed: ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, UAV preparation and launch sites, power and communication nodes. Without these, the base's capacity to assemble, fuel, and deploy drones was crippled. For Russia's war machine, the implications were severe. Deploying additional soldiers to the front becomes meaningless if the supply systems that support them fail. Without fuel, drones, and ammunition reaching the units that need them, thousands of troops become vulnerable on a modern battlefield. Ukraine had struck directly at the logistical backbone of Russia's drone warfare. Yet what made the night of November 5th historic wasn't just the destruction in Donetsk. Something even deeper, geographically and strategically, was about to shake Moscow's confidence. The shock deep inside Russia. Far from the front lines, another strike was unfolding, one that would reach deeper into Russia than almost any previous attack. The target was the town of Volgograd, located roughly 350 kilometers northeast of Moscow. There, Flames engulfed the Kostroma GRES power plant, Russia's third-largest thermal power facility and a cornerstone of its energy grid. The plant sits 730 kilometers from Ukrainian territory, a distance long believed to be protected by Russia's layered air defense doctrine. Yet the flames told a different story. With an installed capacity of 3,600 megawatts, this station plays an essential role in supplying electricity across Russia's western and central regions. Its vulnerability raised troubling questions for Moscow. If a site this critical, this deeply embedded within Russian territory, could be struck, what else was at risk? Local officials attempted to reassure the public. Kostroma's governor, Sergei Sitnikov, claimed defenses intercepted the drones and insisted energy supplies were unaffected. But satellite images and footage from the scene showed a large fire at the plant's gas distribution section, evidence contradicting attempts to minimize the damage. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Official statements promising stability clashed with images of blazing infrastructure. The narrative of total control was breaking, replaced by uncertainty that ordinary Russians could see for themselves. And as this unfolded, another key node of Russian energy production came under fire. In southern Russia, Ukrainian drones targeted the massive Volgograd oil refinery owned by Lukoil. With an annual processing capacity of nearly 16 million tons, it handles around 6% of Russia's total crude output, fuel that powers not only civilian transport, but also military vehicles, armored equipment, and aircraft. This was not merely symbolism. It was a direct challenge to Russia's ability to sustain extended operations. But the attack also had an unexpected consequence. A nearby residential building was damaged by falling debris, and one civilian tragically lost his life. Some reports suggested the damage may have been caused not by a Ukrainian strike, but by a misfired Russian air defense missile. Another sign of the pressure facing Russia's defensive infrastructure. For months, the Kremlin maintained that the conflict was contained, limited, and distant. But these events confronted Russian citizens with a different reality, one in which the war had breached the boundaries they were told would protect them. Crimea ignites, and a strategic picture emerges. While Donetsk, Kostroma, and Volgograd burned, another strike unfolded in Crimea. Territory Russia has tightly fortified and treated as a symbolic stronghold. In the occupied city of Simferopol, a large fuel depot belonging to Crim Techno-Postash was hit. Witnesses recorded drones overhead before powerful explosions triggered fires that consumed storage tanks. The attack showed that even one of Russia's most heavily defended regions was not beyond reach. With multiple critical sites hit within hours, a larger pattern became unmistakable. On November 4th, Russia launched 130 drones at Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, striking ports, energy systems, and residential areas. On November 5th, Ukraine responded with a coordinated series of strikes that dismantled a drone logistics hub containing roughly 1,000 UAVs, a massive oil refinery essential to Russia's military fuel supply, a major thermal power station hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory, a key fuel depot in occupied Crimea. This was not randomness. It was a deliberate strategy aimed at forcing Russia into an impossible position. Every modern military depends on air defenses, but those systems are limited. They cannot be everywhere at the same time. Ukraine's strikes forced the Kremlin to choose. Should it protect the front lines, where battles are ongoing, defend vital energy facilities deep inside the country, shield key ports and refineries, or secure the political core around Moscow? Russia does not possess enough systems to cover all of these at once, and the numbers reveal the consequences. According to independent analyses, repeated strikes on drone production and storage sites inside Russia had already reduced the number of Shahed launches by 33% between July and August. The destruction of the Donetsk stockpile threatened to disrupt Russia's winter strategy even further. The Kremlin's official response claimed dozens of Ukrainian drones were intercepted, yet provided no explanation for the fires in Kostroma, the damage in Volgograd, or the explosions in Crimea. The gap between official statements and visible reality widened. Two philosophies were now clashing. Russia's approach, overwhelmed through sheer quantity, mass-producing UAVs and launching them in waves. Ukraine's approach, eliminate supply lines, and strike high-value infrastructure with targeted precision. On November 5th, Ukraine's strategy proved devastatingly effective. A war that reaches inside Russia. The wave of strikes on November 5th reshaped not only military calculations, but also something far deeper: the perception of safety inside Russia itself. In Volgograd, the death of a 48-year-old civilian and the damage to a 24-story residential building forced authorities to acknowledge that the conflict was no longer confined to distant borders. For years, Russian citizens had been assured that the fighting would remain far from their homes. But now, explosions, fires, and debris were appearing in cities hundreds of kilometers from Ukraine. This was a turning point. The idea of a contained operation began to fracture. Russian air defenses, once portrayed as impenetrable, faced increasing pressure. Social media circulated claims that some of the destruction may have been caused by misfired defensive missiles. Whether true or not, the mere existence of such allegations reflected a growing doubt within the population. Meanwhile, airports across Russia suspended operations. 13 major airports halted flights due to the threat of UAV activity, directly affecting ordinary travel and daily routines. Disruptions spread across regions long considered insulated from the consequences of war. Then came incidents that cut even closer to Moscow's sense of national pride. The Russian Freedom Legion, an anti-Kremlin group fighting alongside Ukraine, announced operations targeting ammunition transport lines inside Russia. Dozens of locomotives reportedly carrying military supplies were damaged in sabotage efforts. These strikes disrupted supply chains from the inside, complicating the already strained logistics Russia relied on to maintain its war effort. And at nearly the same time, another symbol of national ambition faltered. At the Vostochny Cosmodrome, a key facility meant to represent Russia's technological future, the electricity was cut off due to unpaid bills exceeding $650,000. Power to the Angara rocket launch complex was suspended, halting operations. The image was stark. While Ukraine targeted infrastructure hundreds of kilometers deep inside Russia, internal failures were undermining key systems from within. A space center meant to project strength struggled to keep its lights on. The overall picture became increasingly difficult to ignore. From the outside, Ukraine was striking energy facilities essential to Russia's stability. From the inside, resistance movements were disrupting supply lines and infrastructure. Economically, the cost of defending vast territory elevated pressure on Russia's resources. The war was no longer something that could be hidden behind official statements. It was now affecting daily life, infrastructure, and the national psyche. Cracks appearing among Russia's allies. While military infrastructure and domestic stability were under strain, another problem emerged, one that threatened Russia's place in the geopolitical landscape: the growing uncertainty among its foreign partners. Russia has leaned heavily on its relationships with Iran, China, and North Korea throughout the conflict. These partnerships supplied weapons, ammunition, drones, and diplomatic support at critical moments. But allies watch closely, not just the battlefield, but the trajectory of a nation's power. And the events of November 5th posed uncomfortable questions. Iran had supplied thousands of Shahed-type drones, but Ukraine's single-night destruction of roughly 1,000 of them raised doubts about the effectiveness of that investment. Drones meant to shift the balance were instead eliminated before they could be launched. For Tehran, this forced a reassessment. What value remained in a strategy where entire stockpiles could vanish in one coordinated strike? China publicly spoke of a no-limits partnership, but Beijing is deeply pragmatic. It supports Russia to counter Western influence, but not at the cost of attaching itself to a failing strategy. The inability to protect critical infrastructure deep inside Russian territory suggested vulnerabilities Beijing has to calculate carefully. North Korea, meanwhile, provided ammunition and artillery shells. But if the logistical corridors inside Russia were repeatedly disrupted, either by Ukrainian strikes or internal sabotage, the value of those shipments diminished sharply. To Russia's allies, the message was unmistakable. A country that struggles to safeguard power plants, refineries, and space facilities deep in its interior faces significant limitations. The perception of Putin as a decisive leader capable of reshaping global power relationships weakened. What they saw was not a state projecting order, but one fighting to maintain it. And that shift matters. Allies are drawn to strength, predictability, and leverage. They distance themselves from instability. By now, the pattern was clear. Russia was losing on the battlefield, struggling with internal disruptions, and facing cracks in its alliances. The combined effects were undermining confidence in its long-term strategy. But the biggest symbolic blow of all was still tied to the events in Donetsk, when nearly 1,000 UAVs, stored for a decisive winter campaign, were eliminated in a matter of minutes. It wasn't just equipment that disappeared that night. It was something far more important to Russia's leadership. The night Putin lost more than UAVs. What vanished in Donetsk on the night of November 5th wasn't limited to weapons or military hardware. The strike destroyed nearly 1,000 drones and more than 1,000 warheads. But the symbolic impact was far greater. For years, Vladimir Putin had told the Russian population that the war would never touch them, that fighting would remain distant, controlled, and external. But now, with fires in Kostroma, explosions in Volgograd, and debris striking civilian buildings, that promise was impossible to maintain. The destruction of the Donetsk stockpile represented the collapse of a narrative, the belief that Russia could apply pressure on Ukraine without facing consequences at home. And as images of burning infrastructure spread across Russian social media, citizens began to understand that the conflict was no longer something happening somewhere else. It was now influencing their electricity, their mobility, their economy, and their daily sense of stability. At the same time, the Kremlin's official statements strained credibility. Claims of intercepting dozens of Ukrainian drones clashed with visual evidence showing burning refineries and damaged power stations. The public could compare what was said with what they saw, and the contradictions spoke louder than the announcements. The November 5th strikes also demonstrated a shift in Ukraine's strategy. Instead of responding to attacks with isolated counterstrikes, Ukraine executed a coordinated multi-point operation that disrupted Russia's logistics, energy, and supply routes simultaneously. This had two major consequences. It undermined the planning for a winter offensive, one built heavily on drone saturation and pressure on Ukraine's power grid. It revealed a vulnerability in Russia's defensive structure, showing that even deep, critical facilities were no longer safe. For Russia, the loss wasn't just military. It was psychological and structural. Within 24 hours, Ukraine had shattered a stockpile Russia spent months constructing, weakened energy output in key regions, and demonstrated that distance was no guarantee of safety. For a government that relies heavily on the perception of strength, the optics were significant. What disappeared that night was not only capability, it was confidence, both internally and externally. And this shift fed directly into a broader question spreading within Russia. How long can this continue? A country at a crossroads. As the dust settled from the attacks, a larger reality emerged. Russia was confronting simultaneous pressures on multiple fronts: military pressure on the battlefield, economic pressure from sustaining prolonged operations, internal pressure from disruptions and sabotage, international pressure from allies questioning long-term reliability. Each factor alone would be difficult. Together, they formed a crisis that no government could easily manage. The elimination of the Donetsk UAV stockpile crippled Russia's ability to launch large-scale drone assaults in the short term. The strikes on energy facilities challenged the stability of regions far from the fighting. The disruptions at airports revealed how quickly daily life could be thrown off balance. And the sabotage of supply lines by anti-Kremlin groups weakened the infrastructure Russia relied on to sustain its military. Even more damaging was the psychological shift among the population. The belief that the war was something distant had been replaced with a growing awareness that it could reach their homes, jobs, and essential services. Meanwhile, partners like Iran, China, and North Korea watched carefully. Their support depended on the assumption that Russia would remain a stable, powerful counterweight to Western influence. But doubts were rising. The events of November 5th forced a question that even Russia's closest allies needed to consider. Is Russia capable of protecting the systems that hold its state together? Ukraine's strategy, built on targeted strikes and efficient reconnaissance, had flipped the logic of the war. Instead of matching Russia in numbers, Ukraine focused on undermining the infrastructure that made those numbers useful. By striking fuel, power, and logistics, Ukraine created a long-term disadvantage for Russia, one that couldn't be solved simply by moving more troops to the front. And this is where the true impact of the November 5th attacks becomes clear. Russia wasn't just losing equipment or facilities. It was losing time, resources, and the ability to reassure its own citizens. The war had moved from the battlefield into the fabric of everyday life, and the trajectory was increasingly difficult to reverse. A system under strain. The broader landscape around Russia in late 2025 revealed a state grappling with challenges on every level. Externally, Ukraine was executing precise strikes on energy hubs, supply depots, and drone bases located deep inside Russian territory. Internally, resistance groups were targeting critical transport lines, amplifying disruptions from the inside out. And economically, cracks were widening. Russia's energy network, once considered one of the most secure foundations of its national power, had shown signs of vulnerability. Fires at power stations and refineries disrupted output, while the cost of maintaining extensive air defense coverage across a vast country surged. Every drone intercepted, every missile launched in response, carried an economic price tag that strained an already pressured system. The suspension of flights at 13 major airports added to the sense of instability. For millions of Russian citizens, the disruptions were no longer distant news. They were tangible, affecting daily movement, business, and personal life. Each closure served as a reminder that national infrastructure was not immune to the shifting dynamics of the conflict. At the same time, resistance groups operating within Russia continued to sabotage military logistics. Reports from the Russian Freedom Legion detailed the destruction of locomotives carrying ammunition across key railway routes. These disruptions slowed supply chains that were already stretched thin, forcing the military to divert resources, personnel, and time to repairs. Then came the situation at the Vostochny Cosmodrome, an unexpected symbol of deeper issues. Electricity to the Angara rocket launch complex was cut off due to unpaid debts, halting operations at a site meant to represent Russia's technological aspirations. The contrast was sharp. A nation fighting to project power on multiple fronts was simultaneously struggling to maintain one of its flagship strategic facilities. Taken together, these events painted a picture of a system stressed far beyond public acknowledgement. A system forced to confront internal weaknesses at the same time as it faced external pressure. And in the center of that picture stood the consequences of the strike on Donetsk. A single night in which nearly 1,000 drones, prepared for a decisive winter campaign, were reduced to ash. What disappeared was not merely equipment. It was the foundation of a strategy built for the months ahead. The question lingering across Russia was no longer whether challenges existed, but whether the state had the capacity to respond to all of them at once. A moment of reckoning. As the impact of the November strikes became fully visible, a realization began to crystallize across Russia, Ukraine, and among observers worldwide. The war had entered a new phase, one defined less by territorial gains and more by the struggle to maintain stability, control, and credibility. Ukraine's strategy demonstrated how precision, coordination, and targeted pressure could outweigh sheer volume. By striking fuel reserves, power systems, and logistics hubs, Ukraine forced Russia to confront problems that could not be solved through numbers alone. Russia now faced a dilemma with no easy solutions. Should it move air defenses away from the front to protect deep infrastructure? Could it sustain a winter campaign without the drone stockpile lost in Donetsk? Would allies continue offering support if they doubted the country's long-term stability? And how would Russian citizens respond as disruptions reached deeper into daily life? The attacks of November 5th didn't just damage infrastructure. They altered perceptions, exposed vulnerabilities, and challenged assumptions about the direction of the conflict. For the first time, large segments of the Russian public witnessed the consequences of the war in ways they could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, Ukraine's operations revealed a strategic shift that would continue shaping events. The recognition that undermining infrastructure and supply chains could be just as impactful as advancing on the battlefield itself. And as Russia faced challenges across military, economic, internal, and diplomatic fronts, a final question emerged, one that carried weight far beyond a single night of explosions. How long can a nation sustain pressure from every direction before something breaks? The events of November 5th offered no immediate answer, but they marked a turning point, one in which the war was no longer distant, controlled, or predictable. It had become a struggle that touched every layer of Russian society, governance, and global positioning. And the reverberations from that night will continue shaping the next chapter of this conflict. If you want to stay informed as this story continues to unfold, consider subscribing to MGE so you don't miss the next chapter in this evolving conflict.